Hi, my name is Jose Martin del Campo, and this is my video presentation on the topic of humanitarian issues. This topic has 4 chapters, which include immigration, capital punishment, torture, and animal rights. And it follows the discussions of Bianca, Lauren, and Micah as they seek to find some common ground when discussing these topics. On the topic of immigration, there's a point I'd like to address which is brought up by Bianca. She mentions that if immigrant labor wasn't available and companies had to pay significantly more for domestic labor, that could threaten their business. Furthermore, if labor costs go up, then the price of the produce would increase as well, hurting the consumer in America. To address this point, I would bring up the topic of slavery. During those times, the South refused to abolish its practice because their economy was very heavily dependent on the free labor that slaves provided, which kept their costs down and livelihood up. The point that Bianca is trying to argue is that without the cheap immigrant labor that we have today, our economy would not survive. And this is exactly what the South was arguing with slavery. Just because a practice provides a positive outcome doesn't mean that it's right. Illegal immigrants are often treated with lower wages and harder conditions because the employers know that they would do the job. I would argue that in this sense, illegal immigration is a deterrent for the United States and our principles, since we're promoting an idea that is very primitive and very crude against humans. On the topic for capital punishment, I would like to address a point that is also brought up by Bianca. She mentions how a man was wrongfully sentenced to death after he was convicted for a murder that he did not commit. She questions why killing a criminal would ever be necessary if society can be protected by locking them away, which would be a more humane practice. To this, I would like to think back on Magnuson's teaching, which says that it is our Christian duty to provide justice for the people. I don't like the position that locking up a murderer away forever qualifies as protecting society. By doing this, we're not giving the right message that there is a serious punishment for committing a terrible crime. Prisons in El Salvador keep their convicts constantly active and doing community service that would benefit the society that they left behind. I think the United States will have to do something similar, where instead of just keeping them locked up away doing nothing but being a burden on the taxpayer. On the chapter for torture, I would like to address a point that is not brought up by our main cast, but instead is brought up by another student within their class. He mentions an example where the DHS, or the Department of Homeland Security, was looking to torture a terrorist so they could get information out of him to find the location of a bomb, and in turn, save thousands of lives. Holmes defines utilitarianism as seeking the greatest good for the greatest number of people. In this case, torturing this terrorist would result in the greatest good because thousands of lives would be saved at his expense. However, a point that is also brought up in the previous chapter on capital punishment I think is also applicable here. Just because something provides a positive outcome doesn't mean that it is a right action to take. In this case, I think the utilitarian point of view opens up a gray area where some may view that torture is justified in cases where others might not think it's so moral to do so. Personally, I don't like the idea where the end justifies the means. This goes hand in hand with the point that Kant makes up, where it is not moral to see someone as a means to an end, and I think torture falls in this category. Kant says that we should do to others what we expect to be done to us. So if a terrorist decides to take human lives, he should expect a similar punishment to be applied to him. A point that is brought up in this chapter is that torture depreciates the value that we place on human lives. However, I would argue that the moment someone makes a conscious decision to hurt and kill other people, in that moment, they depart from their human rights. The last chapter focuses on animal rights, and I would like to address a point that Lauren brings up when talking to Ms. Lazulay, a zoologist from Riverbend Zoological Park. In this chapter, Ms. Lazulay argues that only members of a moral community have rights at all. As defined in this chapter, a moral community is a group of persons who live in relationship with each other in accordance with moral rules. Ms. Lazulay argues that animals do not form such communities and thus are not entitled to the same rights as humans. The point that Lauren brings up is that babies and intellectually disabled persons cannot partake in these moral communities, yet we as humans welcome them and care for them. This is a line of thinking that I agree with, which I think perfectly challenges the point that Ms. Lazulay was making. Just because someone cannot partake in our society doesn't mean that we have to exclude them or not welcome them with the same level of rights that we attribute to ourselves. The rights that we attribute to animals, I think, fall within our Christian duty to care for the creation that God entrusted us with. This means that even activities that revolve in our consumption of animals, we need to perform humane tasks that protect them and limit suffering. These are all the chapters within the topic of humanitarian issues. Thank you for watching my video presentation.